The moment I stepped into Jake's house, I felt an odd flutter in my stomach. I was just popping in to borrow a book, something innocent and simple. But as soon as I crossed the threshold, I was greeted by a sight that sent my heart racing. Jake, shirtless, bent over a patch of freshly turned earth in his garden. The sunlight danced across his skin, highlighting the muscles in his back as he worked. "Hey there," he said, glancing up, a smirk playing on his lips. "Need something?" I swallowed hard, trying to regain my composure. "Just a book. You know, for the weekend," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Our eyes locked, and in that instant, the air between us thickened with an unspoken tension. The question lingered, heavy and electric. What were we really about to do? Jake stepped closer, wiping dirt from his hands onto his shorts, his gaze never leaving mine. "You sure that's all you want?" he asked, his tone teasing yet filled with something deeper. I could feel my pulse quicken, a rush of excitement mingled with guilt. I don't know," I admitted, my heart pounding. The thought of Tom flashed through my mind, but it felt distant, almost unreal in this moment. Jake took another step forward, closing the gap between us, his voice low and inviting. "Maybe we could explore what else is on your mind," he suggested, a cheeky grin spreading across his face. The question hung between us, heavy and tantalizing. What were we really about to do? I felt a mix of fear and thrill, caught between the safety of my familiar life and the allure of something forbidden. I remember the moment I stepped into Jake's house as vividly as if it happened yesterday. It was a typical afternoon, the sun casting a warm glow through the trees, and I had just realized I had forgotten my favorite book at home. I needed it for my book club later that evening. So, I made my way next door, the familiar path feeling strangely heavy under my feet. As I opened the door, I was greeted by the earthy scent of freshly turned soil and the faint sound of tools clanging. I stepped inside, and that's when I saw him. Jake was there, shirtless, his toned body glistening with a light sheen of sweat. He was working on his garden, digging and planting, completely absorbed in his task. The sight was unexpected, and for a moment, I felt rooted to the spot. "Hey there, need something?" he called out, glancing over his shoulder, a playful smile lighting up his face. "Just came to borrow that book you mentioned," I replied, my voice barely concealing the flutter of nerves in my stomach. He turned fully to face me, and our eyes locked. In that instant, the air around us thickened with an unspoken tension. My heart raced as I took in the way his muscles moved with each motion, the way his dark hair fell slightly over his forehead. There was an electricity in the air, a silent question hanging between us. What were we really about to do? "Sure, it's in the living room. Come on in," he said, gesturing for me to enter further. I stepped inside, the warmth of the sun replaced by the intimate atmosphere of his home. As I walked past him, I could feel the heat radiating from his body, and I tried to focus on the task at hand. My mind, however, began to drift. Memories of my wedding day with Tom flooded back. I had been so happy then, standing in that beautiful Seattle park, surrounded by friends and family. Tom's eyes had sparkled with love as he promised me forever. But over the years, things changed. The once vibrant love faded into a routine that felt suffocating. Our days blended into one another, filled with the mundane tasks of life. I found myself longing for something more, something exciting. I had tried to ignore it, to push those feelings aside, but they only grew stronger. Then, there was Jake. I remembered the first time I met him, how he had offered to help me with my garden when I moved in. He had this charisma about him, a charm that drew me in. He was attentive, always listening, always making me laugh. It was easy to forget about my frustrations with Tom when I was with Jake. "Are you okay?" Jake's voice broke through my reverie, pulling me back to the present. He was looking at me with a mix of concern and curiosity. "Yeah, just lost in thought," I admitted, forcing a smile. "Thinking about Tom?" he asked, his tone light but his gaze probing. I hesitated. The truth was, I had been thinking about him, but not in the way Jake likely assumed. "Not really," I said softly. "Just life, I guess." "Life can be a drag sometimes," he said, his voice low, almost intimate. "You deserve to have some fun, you know." Those words hung in the air, and I felt a thrill run down my spine. Fun. It sounded so simple, so innocent, yet it implied so much more. I wondered what it would be like to break free, to feel alive in a way I hadn't for years. "Here's your book," he said, handing it to me with a smile that sent butterflies fluttering in my stomach. "But if you're looking for a little adventure, I could help you with that." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart racing at the suggestion, even as caution whispered in my ear. "I mean, life is too short to be bored. How about we grab a coffee sometime? Just us?" His invitation hung in the air, and I could feel my heart pounding. A part of me wanted to say yes, to dive into whatever this was between us, but another part held back, reminding me of the vows I had taken with Tom. Yet, the thought of being with Jake, of experiencing something new, was intoxicating. "Sure, that sounds nice," I finally said, surprising even myself with my eagerness. "Great, let's make it happen," he said, his smile widening. In that moment, I felt a rush of excitement, a thrill of the unknown. It was a small step, but it felt significant. As I left his house, clutching the book tightly in my hands, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change. The weight of my decisions loomed over me, but the prospect of adventure pulled me forward, into a future that felt uncertain, yet thrilling. I couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead, and whether I was ready to let go of the life I had built with Tom. As the late afternoon sun streamed through my window, I realized I had forgotten to return a book to Jake, my neighbor. It was just a simple favor, really. We had exchanged a few pleasantries over the fence, and I had borrowed a novel that had been sitting on my bedside table for weeks. I hesitated for a moment, contemplating whether I should knock on his door. I didn't want to disturb him, but the thought of his charming smile made the decision for me. As I stepped into his garden, the scent of freshly turned earth and blooming flowers greeted me. It was a sight to behold. Jake was out there, shirtless, working on his gardening project. The sunlight glistened on his toned back, and for a moment, I found myself mesmerized. I caught myself biting my lip as I watched him move with such purpose, digging and planting with a grace that was almost poetic. When he finally noticed my presence, our eyes locked. There was a tension in the air, thick and palpable. It was as if time had paused, and the world around us faded into a blur. I felt my heart race, a strange mix of excitement and nervousness bubbling inside me. "Hey, you came to return the book?" he said, breaking the silence. His voice was warm, inviting, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I nodded, trying to shake off the unexpected thrill I felt. "Yes, I just thought I'd drop by and give it back. I hope I didn't interrupt your gardening." He chuckled softly, running a hand through his hair. "Not at all. I could use a break. Want to join me for a cup of coffee? I can make us some." I hesitated for a moment. I knew I should probably say no. After all, I was married to Tom, and I didn't want to cross any lines. But the way Jake looked at me, with a spark of mischief in his eyes, made it hard to refuse. "Sure. Why not?" I found myself saying, even as a small voice in the back of my mind warned me to stop. As we moved inside, I couldn't shake off the feeling of anticipation. The kitchen was warm and inviting, filled with the aroma of freshly ground coffee. Jake worked with a casual confidence that I found incredibly attractive. He handed me a cup, and our fingers brushed against each other, sending a jolt of electricity through me. "Here you go. Just how you like it," he said, his eyes sparkling. I took a sip, and the rich flavor danced on my tongue. We stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between us, thick with unspoken words. "So, how's life treating you? Still busy with that project at work?" he asked, leaning casually against the counter. "Yeah, it's been hectic, but I manage," I replied, forcing a smile. I was aware of how hollow my words sounded. Life with Tom had become a routine, predictable and dull. I could see Jake's curiosity as he studied my face. "You don't seem too convinced. Is everything okay?" He probed gently. I felt a sudden urge to confide in him, to share the burdens I carried, but I caught myself just in time. "It's just, life can be a bit mundane sometimes." Jake nodded, his expression softening. "I get that. Sometimes it helps to break out of the routine. You should try it more often." His gaze lingered on me, and I felt my cheeks flush. There was something about his intensity that both frightened and excited me. I cleared my throat, trying to shift the conversation. "So, what about you? What's your latest project?" As he spoke about his gardening and his plans for the backyard, I found myself genuinely engaged. It felt refreshing to talk to someone who was so passionate about their interests. His enthusiasm was contagious, and I laughed at his sarcastic jokes, feeling the tension between us ebb and flow. Then suddenly, he leaned in closer. I really enjoy our chats. It's nice to have someone to share ideas with." "Me too," I admitted, surprised at my honesty. At that moment, there was a shift in the atmosphere. Our conversation took a more personal turn, and I felt a flutter of something I hadn't felt in a long time. "What do you do for fun when you're not working?" he asked, his voice low and inviting. I thought for a moment, trying to recall the last time I had felt truly excited about anything. "Honestly, I can't remember," I said softly. Jake's eyes darkened slightly, and he took a step closer. "You should let loose a bit. Life's too short to be stuck in a routine." I could feel the heat radiating between us, and I knew I was treading on dangerous ground. "Maybe you're right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. In that instant, it felt like the air crackled with possibility. I could see the question in his eyes, the silent invitation hanging between us. What were we really doing? I felt a rush of adrenaline mixed with fear. "Would you like to come over for coffee again sometime?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost intimate. I hesitated, my heart pounding. I don't know. I shouldn't." Jake smiled, a knowing smile that seemed to challenge my hesitation. It could be just coffee, or maybe something more. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I was standing at a crossroads, and I could feel the weight of my marriage pressing down on me. But the thrill of the unknown was intoxicating, calling to me like a siren. "Let's just take it one step at a time," I finally said, feeling both exhilarated and terrified. "Fair enough. But I hope you know, I'm here if you need someone to talk to," he replied, his gaze unwavering. And just like that, I knew this was only the beginning of something I couldn't fully understand yet. I walked into Jake's house feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. I had just come to borrow a book, but the air was thick with an unspoken tension that I couldn't ignore. As I stepped into the living room, I caught a glimpse of him through the open door to the garden. There he was, Jake, my charming neighbor, working on his latest gardening project, shirtless. The sight of his toned body glistening in the sunlight made my heart race. "Hey," he called out, looking up from his work. I didn't expect to see you today." "Just came to grab that book I lent you," I replied, trying to sound casual, but my voice felt shaky. The way he smiled at me sent a shiver down my spine. "Sure, it's right here," he said, stepping inside. As he moved closer, I could smell the fresh earth and a hint of sweat. It was intoxicating. I watched as he reached for the book on the shelf, his muscles flexing effortlessly. "Here you go," he said, handing me the book. His fingers brushed against mine, and I felt a jolt of electricity pass between us. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and for a moment, the world around us faded away. "Thanks," I said, my heart pounding. There was something about the way he was looking at me. Intense. Hungry. I could feel the question hanging in the air. What are we really doing here? Jake stepped a little closer, his presence overwhelming. "You know, I've been thinking about our last conversation. You seemed a bit distant." I shrugged, trying to play it off. "Just busy, I guess." "Busy with Tom?" he asked, his tone teasing but serious. The mention of my husband sent a wave of guilt crashing over me. "Yeah, you know how it is," I said, forcing a smile. "Life gets routine." His expression shifted, a knowing look in his eyes. "I get that. Sometimes it's nice to break out of that routine." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. There was something dangerously alluring about this conversation. "Right," I murmured, my heart racing. "Do you ever think about what it would be like to explore something new?" he asked, leaning slightly closer. The heat in his gaze made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe." Jake smiled, and in that moment, it felt like everything else faded into the background. The world outside didn't matter. All that mattered was the electric connection between us. I could see the desire in his eyes, and it ignited something deep within me, a part of me that had been dormant for far too long. Suddenly, I was painfully aware of my own feelings, the desire to push boundaries, to feel something different. "Jake?" I started, but the words caught in my throat. "Just think about it," he said softly, stepping back. "I don't want to complicate things for you." But it was too late. My mind was already racing with possibilities, and as I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us. This wasn't just a friendly, neighborly visit anymore. As I stepped back into my own home, I felt a whirlwind of emotions. I glanced at my phone, the screen lighting up with messages from Tom. I felt a pang of guilt, but also a thrill, a dangerous thrill that made my heart race. Over the next few days, Jake's words echoed in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about our encounter. I found myself replaying the moment our fingers touched, the way he looked at me, the tension that had crackled in the air. Then came the messages. It started innocently enough, a simple text asking how my day was going. But soon, the exchanges became more flirtatious. "Did you finish that book?" he texted one evening. "Not yet. Got distracted," I replied, my heart racing as I typed. "By what? Gardening?" he shot back, his tone playful. "Maybe by some thoughts of my charming neighbor," I typed, biting my lip. "Charming, huh? Maybe I should work on my charm more often," he replied, and I could almost hear the smirk in his voice. With each message, the desire between us grew, like a fire that refused to be extinguished. I felt exhilarated, but also guilty as I read his words. The thrill of our secret exchanges was intoxicating. I caught myself daydreaming about what it would be like to be with him. To cross that line, I had never thought I would consider. The idea of betraying Tom began to seep into my mind, not as a fleeting thought, but as a possibility. It terrified me. I loved Tom, didn't I? But as I read Jake's messages, I felt a rush of excitement that I hadn't felt in years. It was wrong. I knew that. But the idea of acting on this attraction was becoming increasingly tempting. One night, I lay in bed next to Tom, the weight of my secret pressing down on me. I could feel him breathing softly beside me, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I closed my eyes, imagining Jake's voice, his laugh, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. Why am I even thinking about this? I whispered to myself. But deep down, I knew I was already in too deep. The messages, the stolen moments, the thrill of it all. It was changing everything. And I had to face the reality that I was on the brink of something I never thought I would consider. I remember the day vividly, the sun glimmering off the leaves, casting playful shadows on the ground as I made my way to Jake's house. I had meant to simply borrow a book, a harmless act that felt so mundane. But as I stepped over the threshold, my heart raced unexpectedly. The air inside was warm and fragrant, a mix of fresh soil and blooming flowers. Jake was in the backyard, his back to me, as he worked on his latest gardening project. I hesitated for a moment, taking in the scene before me. He was shirtless, his toned body glistening with sweat as he dug into the earth. There was something primal and raw about the sight, something that stirred something deep within me. "Hey, Jake," I called out, my voice slightly shaky. He turned, a grin spreading across his face that made my breath hitch. "Hey there, come to help or just to watch?" His playful tone made me laugh, but it was laced with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. "I just came for that book," I replied, trying to sound casual. But the way his gaze lingered on me, those piercing blue eyes, felt electric. "Right, the book. It's inside. Why don't you come in?" He motioned for me to follow him, and I felt a thrill of anticipation wash over me. As I stepped into his house, I was enveloped by a sense of intimacy. The walls were adorned with pictures of his travels, and the air was filled with the smell of something delicious cooking in the kitchen. I felt both comfortable and nervous, a strange combination that only heightened the tension building between us. I followed him into the living room, and as he reached for the book on a shelf, I couldn't help but admire the way his muscles flexed. "Here it is," he said, turning to face me. Our eyes locked, and for a moment, the world around us faded away. The question hung in the air, unspoken yet palpable. What were we really doing? "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. But I didn't move to leave. Instead, I found myself drawn closer, caught in the gravity of the moment. "Do you want to stay for a bit? I could make us some coffee," he suggested, his tone casual. But there was a hint of something deeper behind his words. "Sure, I'd like that," I replied, surprised at my own boldness. As he prepared the coffee, we chatted about trivial things, but the atmosphere crackled with an unnameable tension. Each laugh, each glance, felt charged with a promise of something more. When our hands accidentally brushed against each other while reaching for the mugs, I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through me. "Oops," he said, his voice low and teasing. "Yeah, oops," I echoed, my heart racing. We both laughed, but there was a weight to it, a shared understanding that something was shifting between us. I could feel the pull of desire, undeniable and intoxicating. "Do you ever feel like you're missing something?" Jake asked suddenly, his eyes searching mine. I paused, taken aback by his question. Did he see through the facade I had built? "Sometimes," I admitted, my heart pounding. "Life can become predictable." He nodded, his gaze intense. "I get that. It's easy to fall into a routine and forget what it feels like to truly live." His words struck a chord within me. I thought of Tom, our life together, the way everything had become so monotonous. My heart twisted at the thought, but I couldn't deny the truth in Jake's words. Do you want to go out sometime? Jake asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I felt a thrill at his suggestion, but I also felt a twinge of guilt. I don't know, I started, but even as I spoke, part of me wanted to say yes. Just for a drink, nothing serious, he added, his eyes never leaving mine. Okay, I found myself saying, the word slipping out before I could stop it. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that made my heart flutter. Great. How about tomorrow? Tomorrow sounds good, I replied, feeling a mix of excitement and dread. As the coffee cooled in our hands, the tension between us grew thicker. I could feel the unspoken words hanging in the air, the weight of our choices pressing down on us. I didn't want to think about what this meant for Tom, for my marriage. All I could focus on was Jake and the thrill of this new connection. Just then, our hands met again on the table, fingers grazing against each other. The moment felt charged, and I could see the desire mirrored in Jake's eyes. He leaned closer, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I wanted to lean in, to close the distance, but a part of me hesitated. What are we doing? I whispered, my voice trembling with uncertainty. I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But I can't help wanting to find out. The words hung between us, heavy with meaning. In that moment, I realized we were standing on the precipice of something dangerous and thrilling. I felt alive, and yet I knew I was treading on thin ice. Jake's gaze dropped to my lips, and I felt a rush of heat flood my cheeks. The world outside faded further away as the moment stretched on, filled with unspoken possibilities. What were we about to do? Would I pull away, or would I let myself fall? I remember the day I stepped into Jake's house like it was yesterday. I had come over to borrow a book, something innocent enough that I could justify. But as soon as I crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt charged, heavy with unspoken words and possibilities. I found him in the garden, shirtless and focused on his work. The sun glinted off his skin, highlighting the muscles that moved under his tanned surface. I felt my breath hitch in my throat. "Hey, Sarah," he said, glancing up and flashing a smile that made my heart race. "Come to see my latest project?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just nodded, stepping further into the house, the door closing behind me with a soft click that felt like a starting gun. I could feel the tension building as our eyes met. There was a question lingering in the air, unvoiced but palpable. What were we really doing here? I tried to shake off the feeling, reminding myself I was married to Tom, a good man who loved me. Yet, standing there, watching Jake's hands work the soil, I couldn't help but feel a pull towards him. It was as if the world outside faded away, leaving just the two of us in that moment. I could see the determination in his eyes, the way he lost himself in his passion for gardening. It was captivating. I just wanted to borrow that book you mentioned," I finally managed to say, my voice betraying a slight tremble. "Of course," he replied, stepping closer, his presence overwhelming. "It's in my room. Let me grab it for you." As he moved past me, I caught a whiff of his cologne, mixed with the earthy scent of the garden. It was intoxicating. I felt heat rush to my cheeks as I followed him, my heart pounding louder with each step. I was acutely aware of the distance between us shrinking, the air thick with an electric tension. In his room, he turned to face me, holding the book. "Here it is. I hope you enjoy it. It's one of my favorites." "Thanks," I said, taking the book from his hands. Our fingers brushed against each other, and a jolt of electricity shot through me. I could see the surprise flicker in his eyes, mirrored in my own. The moment hung between us, a fragile thread that felt like it could snap at any second. "Do you ever think about what it would be like if things were different?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I felt my pulse quicken at his words. It was a dangerous question, one that stirred something deep within me. "I don't know what you mean," I said, trying to keep my tone light, but my heart was racing. "I mean, if we weren't just neighbors," he continued, stepping closer. "What if we were more than that?" I couldn't breathe. The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Part of me wanted to deny it, to turn back to the safety of my life with Tom, but another part, the part I had been pushing down for so long, yearned to explore what Jake was suggesting. I felt like I was on the edge of a precipice, and I could either step back or take the leap. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake's eyes darkened, and he took another step closer, closing the distance. Why not? What if it could be something incredible? In that moment, I was lost. The walls I had built around myself began to crumble, and I felt a rush of desire and fear. I wanted to say no, to pull back and remind myself of my vows. But all I could think about was how alive I felt in his presence, how different it was from the routine I shared with Tom. Before I could respond, he leaned in, and the next thing I knew, his lips were on mine. It was an explosion of sensation, raw and electric. I melted into him, my body responding before my mind caught up. The kiss was everything I had been longing for, but was too afraid to admit. I felt a thrill run through me, a heady mix of excitement and danger. As we pulled away, breathless and wide-eyed, the reality of what we had just done crashed over me like a wave. I was crossing a line I had never thought I would even consider, but in that moment, all I could think about was Jake, the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel. The question still lingered, but now it was more urgent. What were we really about to do? I remember the day I stepped into Jake's house, a moment forever etched in my mind. I had gone over to borrow a book, something innocent, or so I thought. As I pushed open the door, the air was thick with the scent of freshly turned earth and blooming flowers. It was a stark contrast to the stale atmosphere I had grown used to at home. When I stepped inside, my heart did a little flip. There he was, Jake, my charming neighbor, working on his gardening project. His back was to me, and as he turned around, my breath caught in my throat. He was shirtless, the sun streaming through the window, casting a warm glow on his toned body. I felt a rush of heat spread across my cheeks, an unfamiliar feeling that sent butterflies swirling in my stomach. "Hey, I didn't expect to see you today," he said, a grin spreading across his face. His eyes sparkled with mischief, and I couldn't help but smile back, despite the sudden tension in the air. "Looking for something specific?" "Just a book. I thought you might have that one I mentioned," I replied, my voice a little shaky. I tried to focus on the reason for my visit, but I couldn't shake the heat radiating from him. "Sure, let me grab it for you," he said, moving closer. Our eyes locked, and for a moment, the world around us faded away. There was an unspoken question hanging in the air between us, a silent inquiry of what might happen next. I could feel my pulse quicken, the tension palpable. "Jake," I started, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't know what I wanted to say. Did I want to confess my feelings? Admit the undeniable attraction that had been building since we first met? Or was I just looking for an excuse to linger a little longer in his presence? "Do you ever think about what we could be?" he said suddenly, his voice low, almost a whisper. I felt my heart race. He had said what I'd been too afraid to voice. I don't know," I managed, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. "I mean, I'm married and—" "Yeah, I know," he interrupted, taking a step closer. The air crackled with anticipation, and I could hardly breathe. But does that really matter? I can see how you look at me, and I can't pretend I don't feel the same way. I bit my lip, torn between loyalty to Tom and this magnetic pull towards Jake. This is all so complicated, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Complicated can be exciting, he replied, his gaze unwavering. It's just a book, right? Why don't we grab a drink and talk? I hesitated, my mind racing. I thought of Tom, of our life together. But the thought of spending more time with Jake was intoxicating. Okay, I finally said, my heart pounding in my chest. As we stepped outside, the sun warmed my face, but the chill of guilt washed over me. I was stepping into a world I wasn't sure I was ready for. But with each passing moment, I felt more alive, more aware of the choices I was making. Jake led the way to his backyard, a space filled with flowers and the smell of fresh soil. He poured us drinks, and we sat on his patio, laughter spilling between us like a gentle stream. Each shared smile felt like a secret, each touch of our hands electric. What about you and Tom? Jake asked, his voice serious. Are you happy? I hesitated, searching for the right words. At times, yes, but it's not the same anymore. Things have changed. I get that, he said, leaning closer. Sometimes we just need something more. The heat of his body was intoxicating, and I felt drawn to him in ways I hadn't anticipated. The tension grew as we shared stories, our laughter mixing with an underlying current of something deeper, something forbidden. Do you think we're being reckless? I asked, suddenly aware of the line we were dancing on. Maybe, he replied, a hint of mischief in his eyes. But isn't that what makes life exciting? Sometimes you have to take risks to feel alive. His words hung in the air, and I found myself agreeing. I was tired of the mundane, tired of feeling invisible in my own life. With Jake, I felt seen, desired. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue around us, I could feel the weight of my choices pressing down on me. I was standing at a crossroads, and I had to decide which path to take. The thrill of the unknown beckoned me, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was on the brink of something extraordinary. Let's not think about it right now, Jake said, his voice low and inviting. Let's just enjoy this moment. And as we leaned in closer, the world outside faded away, leaving just the two of us, on the verge of discovery. I had entered his house looking for a book, but what I found was something far more dangerous and thrilling, an awakening I hadn't known I needed. I never expected that a simple trip to borrow a book from Jake, my neighbor, would unravel everything I thought I knew about myself and my marriage. As I pushed open the door to his house, I was greeted by an unexpected sight. Jake stood in his garden, shirtless, the sun glistening off his tan skin. He was focused on his plants, his muscles flexing as he worked. I felt my heart race, not just from the sight of him, but from the tension that hung in the air between us. Hey, I just came to grab that book you mentioned, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the slight tremor in it. Jake looked up, his eyes meeting mine with a spark that sent shivers down my spine. Sure, come on in. I think I left it on the coffee table. His voice was smooth, almost inviting. I stepped inside, my mind racing with the unspoken question that lingered between us. What were we really about to do? The room was filled with the scent of fresh earth and blooming flowers. I tried to focus on the surroundings rather than the man standing just a few feet away. I could feel the heat radiating off him, pulling me closer, even as I fought against it. It was ridiculous, really. I was a married woman, yet here I was, feeling drawn to my neighbor in a way I hadn't felt in years. Nice place you have here, I said, attempting to make small talk while my heart thudded in my chest. Thanks. I've been working on it for a while, he replied, stepping a little closer. Do you garden? I shook my head, trying to appear casual. Not really. I leave that to Tom. He's the one with the green thumb. Jake's expression shifted slightly, a hint of curiosity mixed with something else. Something more intense. You should give it a try. It's therapeutic, he said, his eyes never leaving mine. There was something electric in the air, a shared understanding that something was brewing beneath the surface. As we stood there, I could feel the tension rising, thick and palpable. I took a breath, attempting to steady my racing thoughts. What was I doing? I had a husband waiting at home, a life built on promises and expectations. Yet, standing there, I felt a flicker of something that had been missing in my life for a long time. Here's the book, he said, breaking the spell as he reached for a worn paperback on the table. Our fingers brushed against each other, a spark igniting at the touch. I looked up, and our eyes locked again, this time with a fiercer intensity. Thanks, I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper, my heart pounding in my ears. There was a question in his gaze, one that reflected my own inner turmoil. Did we dare to cross this line? Do you want to stay for a minute? I could use the company, he offered, his tone casual, but the way he looked at me suggested he wanted more than just conversation. I hesitated, torn between my loyalty to Tom and the undeniable pull I felt towards Jake. But the thrill of the unknown was too tempting, and against my better judgment, I nodded. Sure, just for a little while. We settled on the couch, the space between us filled with unspoken words and desires. Conversations flowed easily, laughter punctuating the air, but every word only seemed to deepen the tension. I could feel the weight of my decisions bearing down on me, yet the thrill of being in his presence was intoxicating. Can I be honest with you? He asked suddenly, his expression turning serious. I nodded, my heart racing. I've been thinking about you a lot lately, ever since we moved in next to each other. A rush of heat spread through me, and I swallowed hard. Really? I didn't think. I trailed off, unsure how to respond. I felt flattered yet terrified. I know it's complicated, and I know you're married, he continued, his voice low and steady. But there's something about you that draws me in. Something I can't ignore. His words sent a shiver down my spine. I felt a mix of excitement and dread wash over me. Jake, I started, but he interrupted me. Just think about it. I'm not trying to push you into anything. I just wanted you to know how I feel. The sincerity in his eyes made my heart flutter, and I knew that whatever walls I had built around myself were beginning to crumble. In that moment, I could no longer deny the truth that had been simmering beneath the surface. I was drawn to him in a way I hadn't felt in years. The thrill of the unknown, the promise of something new, was intoxicating. But the guilt weighed heavily on me, the thought of Tom lurking in the back of my mind. Jake, I don't know what to say, I finally managed, my voice trembling. This is all so confusing. I get it, he said softly, leaning closer. But sometimes, we have to allow ourselves to feel. Life is too short to ignore what we truly want. I looked into his eyes, and for a brief moment, the world outside ceased to exist. I was caught in a web of emotions, each thread pulling me closer to a decision that could change everything. As I left his house that day, clutching the book tightly, I felt a mix of exhilaration and fear coursing through me. I had stepped into a new reality, one where the lines between right and wrong blurred, and I could sense that there was no turning back. The question lingered in the air, echoing in my mind. What was I truly willing to risk for a taste of freedom? The moment I stepped into Jake's house to borrow a book, I never expected my life to change forever. The door creaked open, and there he was. Jake, my charming neighbor, standing in his garden, shirtless. The sun caught the muscles in his arms as he tended to the flowers, and for a brief second, I felt an unexpected rush of heat course through my body. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the feeling. "Hey, you," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "What brings you here?" I forced a smile, my heart racing. "Just looking to borrow that book you mentioned last week." "Sure, come on in," he replied, stepping aside to let me enter. The atmosphere felt charged, thick with an unspoken tension. As I crossed the threshold, I couldn't help but notice how the air around us shifted. The house smelled of fresh soil and blooming flowers, but it was Jake's presence that overwhelmed my senses. The moment our eyes met, something changed. I could see the curiosity in his gaze, and my breath hitched. "You really should let me help you with your garden one of these days," I offered, trying to maintain a casual tone. "Maybe I will," he said, his voice low, almost teasing. I could use an extra pair of hands. I felt a shiver of excitement at the idea. "I'll hold you to that," I replied, my heart pounding. For a heartbeat, the silence enveloped us like a warm blanket, and I could almost hear the question lingering in the air. What were we really about to do? "Do you want some lemonade?" Jake asked, breaking the tension. "It's hot out." "Sure, that sounds nice," I said, trying to sound nonchalant as I followed him into the kitchen. As he turned away, I couldn't help but admire the way his muscles flexed with each movement. "What do you think of the garden?" he asked, glancing back at me. "I've been trying to make it more colorful." "It looks amazing," I replied, genuinely impressed. "You have a talent for it." "Thanks. It's a way for me to escape," he admitted, his tone suddenly serious. "Sometimes it feels like I'm just living for the weekends." "Tell me about it," I said, my heart racing as I realized how much I related to him. Life can get so routine. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, it's easy to get stuck in a rut. But hey, we can change that, right?" I looked at him, feeling a glimmer of hope. "Maybe we can." As we sipped our lemonade, the conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and shared stories. With each passing moment, the air between us became thicker, charged with an undeniable chemistry. I felt a mix of excitement and trepidation, knowing that I was still married to Tom, but the connection with Jake felt so real. "Do you ever feel like you're meant for more than what you have?" Jake asked suddenly, his gaze piercing through me. I hesitated, the question hanging heavily in the air. "Sometimes," I confessed. "I love Tom, but things have become predictable." He looked at me intently, and I could see the understanding in his eyes. "It's okay to want something different." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my choices pressing down on me. "I know. It's just complicated." "Complicated can be good," he said softly, the warmth in his voice making my heart race. "It means you're alive." His words lingered in the air, stirring something deep within me. I could feel the tension building, a magnetic pull drawing us closer. For a moment, I wondered if we were standing on the edge of something dangerous, yet exhilarating. "Jake," I began, but he interrupted me. "Let's not think about complications right now," he said, his voice low and inviting. "Let's just enjoy this moment." I nodded, feeling the walls I had built around my heart begin to crumble. "Okay," I whispered, caught in his gaze. Just as I thought the moment couldn't get more intense, he reached out and brushed his fingers against my hand. It was a simple touch, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. I looked down at our hands, then back up at him, my breath hitching in my throat. "Do you feel that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I admitted, my heart racing. "Good," he said with a playful smirk. Then maybe we should explore this feeling a little more. The invitation hung in the air, and I felt the weight of my choices pressing down on me. I was teetering on the edge, caught between the life I had and the thrill of what could be. The question remained, was I ready to take the plunge? I remember that day vividly, the sun shining brightly as I walked across the lawn to Jake's house. I had just finished my chores, and the idea of borrowing a book seemed like a perfect excuse to see him again. As I approached, I felt a flutter of nervousness in my stomach. It was strange how a simple task could stir such emotions. When I knocked on the door, it swung open almost immediately. Jake stood there, shirtless, his skin glistening with sweat from working in his garden. I felt my cheeks flush, a mix of surprise and something else, something thrilling. His toned arms were covered in dirt, and I couldn't help but admire how effortlessly handsome he looked. "Hey there," he said, a playful smile spreading across his face. "Looking for something specific?" I swallowed hard, trying to focus on the reason for my visit. "Just a book. I thought I could borrow that gardening one you mentioned last week." He stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. As I crossed the threshold, the scent of fresh flowers and soil enveloped me. His living room was filled with sunlight, and I could see the remnants of his gardening project scattered around. But as I turned to him, our eyes locked for a moment that felt like eternity. I could see the warmth in his gaze, and an electric tension hung in the air between us. It was as if the world outside had faded away, leaving just the two of us in that sunlit room. "What are you really after?" he asked, his tone teasing but serious. I felt my heart race. "Just the book, I swear," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Yet, there was an unspoken question hanging between us that neither of us dared to voice. What were we truly doing here? Jake took a step closer, the warmth radiating from him, making it hard to breathe. "You know, I could help you with your garden too. It can be a bit overwhelming at first." I chuckled nervously, but the laughter didn't quite reach my eyes. "I'm not sure I need help. I can manage it." "Are you sure? Gardening can be a lot of work, especially when you're trying to keep things looking nice." I could feel the weight of his gaze, and for a moment, I thought about how different my life had become. The routine with Tom felt so distant, the spark we once had dimmed by years of monotony. I couldn't help but wonder if I was seeking something I didn't even know I was missing. "Maybe I do need help," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled knowingly, and in that instant, I felt a rush of excitement mixed with fear. What was I thinking? I was married, but the thought of spending more time with Jake was intoxicating. "Why don't you come over for coffee later?" he suggested, his eyes glinting with mischief. "I could use some company while I work." I hesitated. My heart raced at the idea, but the thought of Tom lingered at the back of my mind like a shadow. "Okay, coffee sounds good," I finally replied, surprised by my own eagerness. Jake grinned, and I felt a surge of warmth at the sight of his smile. "Great. I'll have it ready by 6. As I left his house, my heart was pounding and my mind raced with thoughts. I was stepping into uncharted territory. What was I getting myself into? But the thrill of the unknown was far more enticing than the life I had at home. That evening, as I prepared for my visit to Jake, I found myself both excited and anxious. The memory of his smile lingered in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. When I arrived at his house, the door opened, and Jake stood there, looking effortlessly charming in a simple t-shirt and jeans. The warmth of his presence welcomed me, and I felt a flutter of anticipation. "Hey, come on in," he said, stepping aside to let me in. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and I felt a sense of comfort wash over me. We settled onto his couch, and the conversation flowed easily, laughter spilling between us like we had known each other for years. As we talked, I began to notice the subtle way he leaned in closer, how his hand brushed against mine as he reached for his mug. I could feel the electric charge in the air, and each accidental touch sent shivers down my spine. "Do you ever feel trapped?" he asked suddenly, his gaze intense. I looked at him, surprised by the question. Trapped? In what sense? In life, in relationships. Sometimes, I think people settle for what they have, instead of going after what they really want. His words struck a chord deep within me, and I felt exposed, as if he could see right through the facade I had built. "I suppose I have felt that way," I confessed. He nodded slowly, the weight of his understanding palpable. "It's easy to get lost in the routine, but what if you could feel alive again? What if you could break free?" The question hung in the air, a challenge that I knew I shouldn't entertain. Yet, the thought of breaking free was so alluring. I felt myself leaning closer to him, drawn in by the intensity of the moment. "Jake," I started, unsure of where my words would lead. He interrupted me, his voice low and inviting. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that you're not alone in this." As our eyes met, I felt a wave of emotions crashing over me. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut through. I knew we were standing at a precipice, and every instinct told me to step back. But there was a part of me that longed to leap, to embrace whatever came next. "Maybe it's time to stop pretending," I whispered, the weight of my confession hanging between us. Jake's response was immediate. He closed the distance between us, his lips finding mine in a kiss that ignited a fire I hadn't realized had been smoldering within. In that moment, everything else faded away. The life I had built with Tom, the guilt, and the fear, they all vanished, leaving only the intoxicating rush of passion and desire. As we kissed, I felt alive in a way I hadn't experienced in years. It was reckless, exhilarating, and utterly forbidden. But in Jake's arms, I was free, unburdened by the constraints of my reality. And as the kiss deepened, I knew I was crossing a line from which there would be no return.